Start.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome all to this final ISBNPA webinar of this ISBNPA webinar series. I am Rick Prince, and I will give a very short introduction on the ISBNPA webinars in general and some housekeeping before handing over to April O, David Chambers, and Cynthia Vinson for their introduction to dissemination and implementation research for new and junior investigators. So as ISBNPA, we are really delighted that we can actually organize those webinars for all of our members. But actually these webinars are organized by the special interest groups which our society is rich. So there are 8 special interest groups at the moment, and you can find them on our website, www.isbnpa.org. And there may be special interest groups that you are interested in, and membership is not limited to one special interest group, so you can join as many as you'd like. So this very webinar is organized by the Policies and Environment Special Interest Group. So this is the system we are using. It is GoToWebinar, and it's one of the most user-friendly systems I think there is around to do the webinars. As you may have seen, you're all muted for obvious reasons, but we do value your interactivity and your questions. So you can ask questions by typing them into the question pane, and then they will be read out by the moderator, April O, of this webinar. So if you actually really don't want your name to be mentioned, be really explicit about this when you ask the question. But it is nice, I think, to know who's asking the question. We may ask you to raise your hand, but we will probably not do that this time. But if there is really time left, we may enable you to raise your hand, and we will unmute you. That means that you can talk and that others can hear you, and that it will be like a normal question. Finally, to really enjoy this webinar at its full capacity, we recommend you using the full screen mode of the system. So one final remark from me is that we do have a few survey questions which pop up after this webinar. So if you would like to wait until we've closed the webinars, they will pop up and they will give us some valuable insights on how this webinar went from your perspective. So now we will start our webinar, the introduction to dissemination and implementation research for new and junior investigators by April O, David Chambers, and Cynthia Vinson, and I will hand over to them right now.
Great, thank you so much, Rick. Well, thank you everyone for joining this webinar. I know we have an international audience, so good morning to some and good evening and good afternoon to others. My name is April O, and I'm a program director at the National Cancer Institute, which is one of the institutes at the National Institutes of Health in the United States. Today we have two speakers who will be joining us to talk about dissemination and implementation research and thinking about policies and environmental research. Our first speaker is David Chambers. He is Deputy Director for Implementation Science at the National Cancer Institute at the National Institutes of Health. Dr. David Chambers leads efforts to build and advance the science of implementation science through funding opportunity announcements, training mechanisms, dissemination platforms, and enhancement of partnerships and networks to integrate research, practice, and policy. Prior to coming to the National Cancer Institute, he was at the Division of Services and Intervention Research at the National Institute of Mental Health, where he ran the Dissemination and Implementation Research Program and managed a portfolio of grants there to study the integration of scientific findings and effective clinical practices in mental health and real-world service settings. Dr. Chambers serves as the Associate Director for Dissemination and Implementation Research, leading NIH initiatives around the coordination of dissemination and implementation research in health, including research announcements across 15 of the NIH institutes and centers, annual scientific conferences, and summer training institutes. Dr. Chambers received his AV degree with honors in economics from Brown University and has an MSc and Doctor of Philosophy degree in Management Studies and Organizational Behavior from Oxford University. Our second speaker is Dr. Cynthia Vincent. She is a Senior Advisor for the Implementation Science Team at the National Cancer Institute. She works on building and sustaining the field of implementation science to enhance the integration of evidence-based guidelines, programs, and policies for cancer control in public health and clinical practice. Dr. Vincent leads dissemination and implementation research training activities, including the annual Training Institute for Dissemination and Implementation Research in Health. She is responsible for working both within NCI and other agencies and organizations at the international, national, state, and local level to translate research funded by NCI into practice. Dr. Vincent holds a doctoral degree in public administration and health policy from GW, or George Washington University, a master in public administration and international development from Rutgers, the State University of New Jersey, and a bachelor's in political science from California State University, Bakersfield. Thank you, David and Cindy, for joining us for this webinar, and I will pass the presentation now over to Dr. Chambers. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody for tuning in. Thanks to April for helping to facilitate, and thanks to ISBNPA for making this all happen. We are going to go relatively quickly, but just the first thing to say is this is an area that both myself and Cindy and others are very passionate about. We're also as accessible as you would like us to be. So as we'll go through a lot of material pretty quickly, the one thing that we're happy to do is follow up with anyone who'd like to learn more, who we can engage with. Our goal, as April had said, is to try and think about the best way to continue to advance the science, and you can help us tremendously with that. It's worth noting also that while a lot of our programs have been more centered around the US-based dissemination implementation research, we've increasingly been trying to encourage work across the globe. And so, again, this is an area where we'd love to talk with each of you further. So I'm trying to advance the slides, and there we go. Okay. And so you'll see for the presentation outline, just briefly, we want to try and explain, at least from where we're coming from, what we see as the challenge, which gives rise to the idea of why dissemination implementation research is important, to go through some specific definitions, recognizing that people are often talking past each other, even using the same terms. We thought it would be helpful just to give you an example of some of the conceptual frameworks that have been developed in this area, and then to talk about some of the growing tools and resources to help investigators and practitioners within this field. So what you should see in front of you is an effort to try and depict what happens if we assume that the end product of research is the publication. So you see at the top, publication pathway. This was a study that Andrew Bayless and Sue Boren had done within 2000 to try and analyze what happens when research is concluded, and we try and see that it can ultimately be implemented into practice to advance health and health care. what you see on the left side is how we lose so much of our original research findings, sometimes because they're negative results that the researchers feel aren't publishable. Sometimes they're submitted, but they're actually not accepted within journal publications. Sometimes they're published, but not actually contained within the right bibliographic databases. They're not often or always used when thinking about systematic reviews or guidelines or textbooks, and they don't always make their way on into widespread implementation. On the right side, you see the variable amount of time that it takes. And again, this says nothing about the time that it took to get to the point where you had research findings. But the summary that we're usually talking about without thinking about where it came from is that it takes 17 years to turn 14% of original research to the benefit of patient care. This says to us that if we think that the end product, the last thing that we do as scientists is simply to publish, we're not going to make much progress at all. And at least for those of us who've just seen the baseball season end in the US, this is a common picture right now, but it tries to underscore the idea as a movie in the 90s, or 89 I think it was, showed that if you build an intervention, an innovation, there's no guarantee that anyone is going to come. Too often we're assuming from the scientific push side that it's really just about creating that perfect thing that we can then hand off to people. But we need to be doing a lot more to think about what happens on the receiving end. And in this case, just because we have this pristine baseball diamond doesn't mean it's going to be filled by anybody. Maybe it's because it's November right now, but maybe it's because we have other preferences, other priorities, and other needs. Another way to think about this is that often we're focusing on the supply of scientific information. We're not thinking about that other side. So you'll see in this cartoon, someone is coming out of an igloo, an obviously cold place, says to their friend or their relative who seems to be peddling snow cones, it's not or demand, it's supply and demand. We often on the scientific end do a really good job of thinking about what can we supply to the masses. But we don't always think about, is this something that's actually needed, that's actually demanded, that actually has a marketplace or a receiver on the other end? And we need to keep both in mind. To put this into context with evidence-based nutrition and physical activity programs, the success of those programs, the impact of those programs are really only as good as how and whether they're adopted, whether providers who would deliver these programs across community and clinical settings are trained to deliver them, if those trained providers then choose to actually deliver the program that they've been trained on, and the degree to which eligible people are receiving the programs. Those who could benefit from improved nutrition, improved physical activity, have access and are actually getting to them. Sometimes we think about if we had even 50% success at each of these steps, adoption, training, implementation, and reception, even if we assumed access and adherence and dosage and maintenance was okay, we'd really only be at 6% of the benefit of what we'd like to have. And another way of conceptualizing this, as our colleague Russ Glasgow, who was here at NCI for a number of years with his REAIM framework, had mentioned, it's not just effectiveness. We talk a lot about the move from efficacy to effectiveness. But in the dissemination and implementation world, we need to be thinking about the reach of our interventions. We need to be thinking about whether they're adopted by various organizations or various communities, the degree to which they're actually delivered properly, they're implemented effectively, and ideally not just that they go in at one particular point in time, but that there's sustained delivery, that the delivery is maintained over the long term. So it brings us to, and this was something that NIH that we thought very carefully about. We recognized that there were a lot of different terms that were focusing on this translational space, but there weren't good definitions, or it wasn't clear how people who were using these terms were defining them. We at NIH decided that we wanted to articulate two specific challenges that we saw for the scientific community. The challenge of effectively disseminating information, distributing information and intervention materials to specific audiences, and their needs and how well those that information is received and acted upon, as well as implementation, which we saw as this more intensive process of trying to adopt and integrate health interventions and really trying to change practice within specific settings. These were ones that have, from the beginning, appeared within many of the activities that we've done at NIH, including the program announcements that help to articulate the scientific priorities for this area, And it's something that we use Jonathan Lomas's 1993 paper distinguishing for knowledge translation between diffusion and the more active processes of dissemination and implementation. I show this larger tent of terms and circles to emphasize that within the broader field where we're trying to impact and improve health and health services, we really see dissemination and implementation research falling within that subset of the health services research. We see that there are other areas of science that nicely complement when we talk about dissemination and implementation research. So a lot of work, not just in quality improvement, but in thinking about the study of those efforts, quality improvement science, we see as fitting within our implementation research boundary. When we think about health communication research and how do we make sure that we get appropriate health information to a range of audiences, we see that to some degree as a subset of this broader challenge of how do we disseminate a whole range of information around interventions and other health information to a whole range of different providers, practitioners, stakeholders. We note that quality improvement as an exercise typically we see outside of the research space, primarily because quality improvement is often defined as trying to work on a local problem and not necessarily create that generalizable information, that generalizable evidence. But it just gives you a sense, we'd love to engage with people across this entire terrain, but we want to make sure that there's a recognition of where do we see dissemination research and its challenges fitting, where do we see implementation research and those challenges, and how do we talk to people who are coming from a more specific health communication or quality improvement frame of reference. So just briefly, when we think about dissemination research, we're thinking about the whole range of processes from where we get evidence into action, right? So we need to be thinking about how good a job are we doing at actually creating the evidence and what assumptions go into that process. How well are we doing at packaging that evidence to be transmitted? How well are we doing with transmitting the evidence through multiple media? How well is that evidence being received, and to what degree does that evidence then translate into some degree of action? I will say that often when we are starting out in this area, in these areas, we assume that we did this very, very well, and we jumped over these steps. We know exactly how to develop and to transmit our evidence, and we know that everyone agrees with us when we're done. We wanted to identify that for the range of different purposes, audiences, and media, we don't necessarily know how to do this well, and we need to study it. On the implementation side, we're often focusing on the left and the right picture. We're often thinking about what are the evidence-based interventions, and we're thinking about what are the health outcomes that they generate. What we then miss are the various processes and the proximal outcomes that get us from this initial intervention to have a broader population impact. And so what we try and do is move away from this idea of the usual, the trial that's just focusing within a given instance on an intervention and what its impact is on individual health, to this cascade of not just what do we deliver, but how do we actually implement those interventions within different settings. And thinking about some of those proximal outcomes of implementation. Are we delivering an intervention? Are we figuring out a way to make that intervention acceptable? Are we figuring out a way to make that intervention sustainable within a system of care? Is it feasibly delivered? To what degree does there need to be a certain fidelity to how the intervention was developed? To what degree are there implementation costs? And to what degree are we penetrating through systems to make sure that all those who could benefit from an intervention are actually getting it? We see those implementation outcomes as having impact on the service systems. And you'll see here, just as an example, the outcomes that the IOM standards of care reports and crossing the quality chasm had identified as things that we want to improve upon within our health systems. And the assumption is that we really need that implementation pathway to be thinking about how do we get these interventions into place, what are the outcomes that they're generating, but what is the knock-on benefit that we're going to have both on the service system and then at the population health level. So quickly wanted to run through a couple of our more commonly referred to dissemination and implementation models. The caveats before we go into the specific models is there really is no comprehensive model that we've seen that actually applies in all settings, in all contexts, for all populations, for all health problems. So we really need to be thinking about different models to answer different questions. Not all of our models are well operationalized, meaning that we may have some holes if we're going to use them in our science as to around measurement, and that we should really be thinking about these models as dynamic. We should, as a research group, think not just that this model was created and it holds true, but how can we extend upon, how can we correct, how can we advance really the empirical and the theoretical basis for our different models. We did a review 3 years ago. Rachel Tabak was the lead author in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine, where we tried to look at the whole range of models that currently exist, or at least that existed as of a few years ago. We'd identified 109 different models around dissemination and implementation. Some of them because our major focus was on research. Some of them we excluded because they weren't as much focused on efforts to contribute to the science base. Some of them were focused more on how do practitioners actually implement things rather than whether we study them. Some of them were not as focused on that local level of dissemination, or they really weren't focusing on the active process of integrating information or interventions over the course of a study. But we ended up with 61 models, and we tried to frame them in terms of how well do they map across dissemination and implementation, how well do they hit the different levels of the socio-ecological framework from individuals all the way on to the broader sort of society or the broader ecology. And then we tried to say to what degree are these well-defined constructs, well-defined elements, or to what degree are they more flexible? And again, a resource that folks can turn to. And so again, we wanted to at least give you some thinking about how we consider use of conceptual models. So obviously, it needs to start with what your research study is intended to try and answer. We recognize that you may already have a model that you're comfortable with, and that's absolutely fine, of course, as long as it fits the questions and the context that you're trying to answer. We see it very important that if you're going to use a model, that you don't just use it on the front end of your study, but you carry it on to each and every aspect. So it really ought to be linked to the aims, to the specific research questions. It really ought to flow through the research design that you use. It ought to be consistent with the measures that you're using, and ideally how you're analyzing the data as it's gathered. I think it's important to also think about how the model that you're using can potentially advance the field of D&I research beyond just the ability to advance your study. Ross Brownson noted in a talk that he gave a couple of years ago that sometimes we shouldn't just be focusing on what do we have within health, but we ought to be looking at other models and frameworks outside of health, which, as Ross says here from his experience as a reviewer, may actually score you some innovation points. A lot of the models overall have common factors associated with them. They're often thinking about the nature of change. They're thinking about to what degree does that specific change, what you're trying to implement, have importance and priority within the local settings. A lot of focus on what does that local context look like, and what are the key factors within the local setting that are likely to either help or hinder implementation efforts. There's also a lot of talk about the external environment beyond, say, an organization or a local community, and most of our models really do focus on a specific target of change. It's worth noting that most of the changes emphasized within the model really do focus on active facilitation, use of local champions, tools, and training, and there are different barriers that they recognize will exist across sites. So leadership can either be a help or a hindrance, different levels of resources, of IT, of inertia within the local organization. Across all of these models are seen to either enhance or detract from efforts to change. So I want to go through just a couple of the models briefly, and here's a quote that I know Russ Glasgow used to highlight, that's a helpful caveat, right? That all models are wrong because they're really trying to simplify things, but hey, some are useful. So we're going to go through what we see as a few useful models. So the first one, which a lot of people have focused on over the years, is Everett Rogers' diffusion of innovations. And I think you'll see this relatively simplistic picture, but I think what it emphasizes is that the intervention, the characteristics of the intervention that we're trying to implement, say a lot about the ultimate success of that implementation effort. That organizational characteristics and a broader environment say a lot about whether we're going to be successful in the ultimate implementation, and ideally in sustainability. And what this model also does, again in this picture relatively simplistically, is recognize that there are different stages. This is going to be a common theme, different stages to the implementation process. And here there's that question of whether are we going to adopt a particular intervention? Then are we going to go further and figure out the best way to get that implemented effectively? And then are we going to ultimately see whether outcomes improved as a result? Laura Damschroeder's consolidated framework for implementation research more recently has become very, very popular and very well used, in part because it's nicely operationalized. The different components of the models have a lot of validated measures that are associated with them. You'll see a similar picture here where, again, you have this intervention and you have an inner setting, a sort of local context, as well as that outer setting, that external context. What's notable here is that there's a recognition that the intervention may need to be adapted over time to better fit within the local settings. So you'll see the way they conceptualize the intervention is it has some core components which science tells us need to be maintained within each and every instance that intervention is delivered, but that there's also this scope where you can actually adapt the intervention to make it fit better within the local setting. And so that's a notable feature of this particular model. It came out of work within the VA, and it's been very popular not only within the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, but also throughout a lot of other research and health setting contexts. A third one is the interactive systems framework that Abe Wandersman and others had developed. What's nice here is that it talks about different systems that are needed to get us from an evidence base to successful implementation. This was primarily identified as a preventive intervention framework, that's what they were focusing on, as you can see by some of the specific terms used. But the recognition is that you have this local delivery system, that you have the effort that goes in, you'll see on the bottom, around making sure that we've got the appropriate evidence, it's reviewed well, and it's identified what is the best evidence base that should be implemented. And then importantly, in between, that you have this support system. You have this effort to try and understand that it's not just plunking evidence into different systems, but it's how do we support those systems to be able to provide better interventions. Do they need general capacity around introducing anything new? Do they need innovation-specific capacity? Is there capacity that needs to be built around the delivery of a particular intervention? And you'll see, similar to others, there's the local climate, there's the macro level policy, there's existing research and theory, and there's funding that's needed in order to make sure that this process works well. Greg Ahrens, this is the next model called the EPIS model, Exploration, Preparation, Implementation, and Sustainment, was an effort similarly to talk about the inner context at, as you'll see, quite good depth, as well as the outer context, and recognizing that those contextual factors are going to change at different stages of the implementation process. So there are things we need to think about when we're first exploring implementation, things we need to think about both locally and with that broader context with regards to the decision to adopt through the active implementation process, and then importantly, what happens over time? How are we able to sustain the delivery of effective interventions? And then the last one that I'll mention is one that is another sort of synthesis. This came out of Trish Greenhall and others within the UK as efforts to review all of that available information, all of the available literature at the time around the diffusion of innovations or knowledge translation. And so again, what you'll see is a lot of different factors across a lot of different levels. The purpose here is not necessarily to say that this is actionable for use, but just to underscore how complex this area can be and how it's our challenge to make sure that we don't come at it with very simplistic views of if we just convince somebody that our evidence is great, then all sorts of change will follow. So just to finish this little section, in terms of selecting a model for study, we encourage you to think about some of these key questions, namely, what are the research questions that I'm trying to answer? What are the levels of change? What are the levels of activity that I'm likely or wanting to explain? What features of context are going to be relevant to those research questions? What's the time frame that I'm dealing with? Are there measures available? And importantly, are we best served by a single model, or is there something that we can do to try and bring different features across these different models that might be helpful to my particular case? So the last part that I'm going to go to is just to recognize, for those who are interested in policy studies, that we at NCI see that dissemination and implementation policy studies are incredibly important as part of our portfolio. You'll see three studies that are mentioned here. Ross Brownson, Jennifer Ibrahim, and Doug Luke's studies are all focusing on different efforts to really try and spur on dissemination at that policy level. You'll see there are different mechanisms, an R01 larger grant, an R03 small grant, and then a R21 exploratory developmental. Just want to underscore that we're very excited to work with those around efforts to understand the impact of different policy.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to come in here and back clean up, keeping with the baseball metaphor, and I just want to share with you some of the dissemination and implementation resources that are out there. Some of those are from the National Cancer Institute, but some of them are from other organizations. The field has grown significantly over the past few years, but here are the URLs for the different resources that I want to share with you. First off, this is our implementation science website, and if you're interested in learning more about the dissemination and implementation research that happens at the National Cancer Institute, I would encourage you to come to this website, and we go through different versions of this, and we're always trying to update and improve it. But the one thing that I would love to highlight, I should say one thing, there's a couple of things. For more information about implementation science and resources, a great place to go is the tab at the top of our page that is about implementation science. And when I have investigators that call and want to talk to me about their funding ideas, their grant concepts, this is generally one of the first places that I send them to. It has a lot of the resources that I'm sharing with you listed on that page. And then I also refer them to the funding page, where you can get access to our funding opportunities. We do have 3 active program announcements. One is an R01, one's an R03, and one's an R21. One is they're getting ready to expire, but they are going to be reissued, so there won't be a lapse in the opportunities. But we also have links to our portfolio of funded grants. So you can go in and you can see the abstracts under our funding page around all of the D&I grants that we have funded, including going all the way back to supplements that we funded in 2003 and on, and I guess probably for about 4 or 5 years there that we funded. So I'd encourage you to explore that, and then some of the tools and training that we have here. When we were talking about models, when David mentioned about models, a lot of people struggle with trying to figure out, how do I choose a dissemination and implementation model for a research study in D&I? And we're fortunate that Borsika Rabin, who was an investigator that has worked in this area for a while, and when she was at Kaiser, she actually developed this wonderful tool that helps you go through and select, adapt, and integrate a model for dissemination and implementation. And you can come in and look through this website based on the constructs that you're interested in and choose an appropriate model or models that you might want to incorporate in your research. So this is what it looks like when you go into the site. You can see that you can choose whether you want to do dissemination or implementation or both. You can look at the socio-ecological levels and choose which ones you're interested in, and then choose the constructs, and based on that you will get a results list that you can further delve into to decide which model might be appropriate for your study. We also have a measures project that had been done at the National Cancer Institute called the Dissemination and Implementation Measures and Methods Initiative. And it's hosted on our Grid-Enabled Measures webpage. And it's an effort where we've gone and tried to reach out to investigators that have used measures in dissemination and implementation and have tested these measures, and allowing them to put them up on a website with their with the documentation and the articles related to them, so that people don't have to recreate some of these measures and they can find tested measures that are available. And this is some of the measures that you can see here, and you can go in and you can rate them. You can see what type of measures are there, what the constructs are, and what the ratings are. And it's still open. You can go in and continue to add to this. Another resource around measurements is the SIRC, the Society for Implementation Research Collaborative. And they have a wonderful resource that's online that allows you to go in and, once again, identify measures. And this is an ongoing effort. The review project, you can see what the outcomes for this project were, that they're really looking at implementation outcomes that were identified by Proctor and colleagues in 2010. And they are organized by CFR, which David showed the model for. You can go through and you can look at the different instruments that are available on this website. So here's an example. You can see, looking at the inner setting, the different types of constructs that you might want to be looking at, and you can pull information for this from that website. You can also look at the intervention rating profile on CIRC. We have a tool for both researchers and practitioners that's available called Cancer Control Planet, and Planet stands for Plan, Link, Act, and Network with Evidence-Based Tools. And this is a bridge between research and practice and was really designed to help people think through what needs to happen in order to move research into practice. The things that I would love to highlight are that we have two topic areas that are relevant for this group. We focus on both diet, nutrition, and physical activity. And if you search on those topic areas, you're going to be taken to a page that gives you all of the information shown on this page: data, collaboration, research synthesis, programs, evaluation, and plans that are very specific to those topic areas. The Research Tested Intervention Programs website is a link off of the Cancer Control Planet website. And this is a website where investigators can submit their programs to be included for use by practitioners. We currently have 161 intervention programs that are posted on this website, and they cover all of the topics that were shown on the Cancer Control Planet homepage, including diet, nutrition, physical activity, and also obesity. So I wanted to show you an example of programs that are on RTIP. We have 52 diet, nutrition, and physical activity programs that have been posted since the site launched in 2003. In order for an investigator to get their program posted on RTIPs, they have to have data that has been published in a peer-reviewed journal, outcomes data on the intervention. They have to have statistically significant positive outcomes for their program, and they actually have to have materials that can be disseminated for use in practice. An interesting thing to note is that out of all of the programs that are posted on RTIPs, the physical activity programs are generally distributed by the investigator. But if the investigator does not want to distribute the materials themselves, we're happy to digitize the materials and make them available free of charge on our website. We don't really have a bias towards making things free or having someone charge for them. We just want to make sure that these types of programs that have been tested in a research study actually get put into practice. So here is an actual study summary. Excuse me, my phone's ringing. It'll go away in a second. This is the Alberta Project's Promoting Active Living and Healthy Eating project. What you see here is a program summary that shows the need, the program. It links to the Community Preventive Services Task Force, tells you the time required, who the audience that the study was designed for, the settings, what resources are required. It provides a brief summary about the study, highlights the key findings, and also links to the publications. The highlights on this page are shown in the upper right-hand corner so that you can get a snapshot, but you can read through the entire page to get an overview of the entire program. We review all of these programs, and they go through a secondary round of peer review where they are rated, and those RTIP scores are shown here. We rate programs on research integrity, intervention impact, dissemination capability, and we also do a scoring on re-aim. Another resource that we wanted to highlight is the Research to Reality, NCI's Community of Practice, which we really view as a living lab for implementation science. Research to Reality was designed to promote collaboration between researchers and practitioners so that we could focus on implementing evidence-based approaches. It's designed to be a learning community, and on this website you have access to monthly cyber seminars. You can open up discussions. We crosswalk the RTIP's website with the Research to Reality by highlighting investigators as they post their programs, and we also really try and do a good job through our cyber seminars and other ways of making sure that wherever possible that there's a research practice and policy voice coming through. You can see that it's really a robust community with more than 2,300 cancer control practitioners, researchers, students, and clinicians engaging in this site. And we had over 80,000 page views in 2014. It's a wonderful resource if you're thinking about what type of research questions you should be asking and you want to get input from the field. And we can also try and help you with linking in with policymakers and with practitioners to understand what the research needs are. So we'd encourage you to join the site, to go in and look at it, and engage in some of the discussions that happen. And with that, we want to pause and actually stop for questions. And there is a question that was posed initially. So I don't know if we should just go ahead with Rick. Yeah, it's hard for me to make it bigger, but I think this one is actually getting posed to David. So
okay.
This question is from Rick, and he wanted to know if we study environmental impacts, such as new transport infrastructure, on physical activity, it becomes more common to take a systems perspective. So context is important in how an intervention works, how effective it is. Thus, in various settings, you need to do something else, tweak your intervention. So how would you define fidelity then? It may be hard to score things like the lesson is implemented, this exercise is done, this brochure is given out.
Oh, and then he followed up to say that to some degree, Laura Damschroeder's model gives me part of the answer. Thanks, Rick. And then maybe, okay. Okay, so I mean, I think it really is a great question, and I think it moves to beyond a specific model. I think it moves to a broader opportunity that we don't actually do nearly as well as we should as a field on, and that is that issue of what is meaningful fidelity. To some degree, with certain interventions, we may be limited by what the prior studies were able to show. Not all intervention trials really get at what are the core components of an intervention, and sometimes it falls to us on the implementation science side to try and figure out, can we build that question in? So do we have a link to individual level outcomes so that we might be able to inform the relationship of the delivery of different components of that intervention to the potential outcomes for those who receive this set of components versus that? There's some people who have looked at various adaptive designs and how might we use those in the context of implementation that can not only help us to think about how different models guide us, but actually build more of an information, more of an evidence base around a given intervention. So I think you're absolutely right that there's often that tension between you're either faithful to the way the intervention was originally developed or you're sort of going into these sort of dangerous territory. I think we can do a better job as a group, and it would be great to follow up with folks who are interested to build out a more robust science of adaptation. And how do we really understand about the local adaptation? Robert Wood Johnson Foundation in the U.S. has done some work to try and stimulate some local efforts to gather information on adaptation, but there's a lot more that we can do. So thanks at least for stimulating, I think, what's a really growing, an area growing of importance for us in D&I.
So another question came in from Elizabeth Abla wanting to know where can you get the materials for our tips? And since I'm still sharing my screen, I'm actually going to show you where you can do that. Let me come in here.
Yep.
So if I go to, I'm going to type in research tested intervention programs, and we're going to get in here. You'll see our tips, and if you come in here, you can go in and you can search for programs. I just went in and I chose physical activity and diet nutrition to start with. I'm going to have to move some of this so I can get to it. I search, and you wanted to know about Seattle's 5 a day, so I'm going to scroll down to Seattle 5 a day. And I will show you the Seattle 5 a day program. You can come in here. If you click on the products piece on the left-hand side, it's going to take you to a page that shows you all of the materials that were used in that study. You can preview all of those materials, or at least if they're small. If they're big, you preview them, or you can download them for use. They're free of charge. So all of the materials, the intervention manual, the questionnaires, etc., are available here. This is one of the programs that are free of charge. If the investigator actually was disseminating the program themselves, you would just see previews for every single product. We always make sure you can see it, but then there would be a link to the investigator or the investigator's website where you would have to either download the materials or order them directly from the investigator. So let me see, are there any other questions? Okay, so somewhat related to the previous questions in our tips, there's a long list of interventions, but are the prerequisites of the interventions also given if needed? If we need to change an environment effectiveness may be highly dependent on the context in which it's implemented. So I'm not sure if that's about the prerequisites for posting or if it's a prerequisite around what the study did, because these are actual outcomes from specific studies. So you do have, what we try and do here is really give all the information about the specific program that was studied, understanding that if you want to use this program in another setting, that you are probably going to have to adapt it and you're going to have to retest it. We aren't endorsing any of these programs for use as is. Many of them, and most of them, probably need to be adapted in some manner because these were done in rigorous studies that are in a controlled environment. Very few places in actual practice probably have the resources to deliver these programs in reality. So you have to kind of be able to choose them, adapt them, but there are places where you can get information on what is necessary for adapting an intervention such as this, and that's actually available on the website as well. If you're on the RTIPS homepage, which I'm going back, there's a tool available for putting public health evidence into action, which was created by the Cancer Prevention Research Control Network. And it walks through the different steps necessary for taking something off of RTIPS or another evidence-based intervention and testing it, adapting it, and putting it into practice. So I agree that context is very important, and you have to take that into consideration. You're asking about under which context it worked and which it didn't. We don't know that because these programs were tested, we know where it was tested. What I would love to see is a dialogue on research to reality. Ideally, I would love to see someone going into research to reality saying, hey, I have tried this type of an intervention, or I'm doing research on this. What have you done with it? Where has it worked? Where hasn't it worked? And having some of those dialogues happening between researchers and also between researchers and practitioners so we can understand more of that.
And the other thing that we're interested in exploring, and we're looking at other models for this, but the way in which or through which we could gather information from those who are trying to use the specific practices within whatever settings they are to be able to report around that experience. So often our implementation evidence is limited to those organized funded studies, but there's so much local implementation that's happening at all times that we don't really learn as much from as we would like to. So we'd love to explore ways, research to reality, as Cindy mentioned, is one, but are there other ways that we can enhance the evidence base around a given intervention so that we have just a better way of saying, what are the implications of doing this kind of adaptation? What are the ways in which we might actually be able to do better with an intervention than we were in the initial test of it? Those are the kinds of things that we just right now don't gather the evidence that we would love to have. But over time, it's kind of along those lines of the practice-based evidence argument, or just really learning from all of the different ways in which we're trying to apply the programs that were developed, ideally to reach people, and we don't always know how well they're benefiting from them.
Okay, thank you. Excellent. Very good to hear that. So what I want to ask the attendees, if you want to ask a question in person, you can raise your hand if you want to. Then we will unmute you, and then you can talk directly to our presenters. And if there are any questions, please ask them. So are there any questions still? The audience, you can either type them or raise your hand, and then I will give you the microphone, or your own microphone.
Sorry, we're just on this end trying to see if we can see any hands.
No, I can't see any hands, so. So yeah, I have still one more question from my side. So I'm really, so you may have got at this, but I'm really working more in this, well, infrastructural changes and evaluating those changes. And so what we try, for instance, new cycle paths, etc. So what we often try to do is to, well, present our research, etc., to policymakers, and they really like the way we do it with workshops, etc. But then, and that's where this context issue comes in again. Then they really always like say, well, this works in Cambridge, but does it work in Leeds or London, etc. So it's we do have this evidence that something works in our context, and I mean I'm the first to say that context is dependent. But how can you actually convince policymakers, well, that they can, well, that there is some evidence that this may work, and that may actually be a first step to change things? Or is that?
Yeah, sorry. So it's a great question, and I think, you know, one person who we often look to in our community to, you know, research community to help us with that is Ross Brownson, who spent actually a fair amount of time on the policy, you know, state health department side before moving more into the research on policy venue, and so he gives, I think, a very nice talk about, you know, multiple talks that we probably have available on our website, just about the different influences and the different types of evidence that seem to be more likely to move policymakers. I know one thing that has been, you know, recently employed to some degree is the degree to which one can show that the data is comparable or are comparable to a different a different setting in terms of the population, in terms of the infrastructure. You know, sometimes people say, well, sure, if you're going to do something in New York City or in Boston, it may not work as well with a less populous area. But there are ways, at least, of trying to, you know, either use system science or, you know, models to try and extrapolate with sort of similar population, similar density, and some degree of markers with, you know, in terms of infrastructure. But I think you're right that at times it's, well, how can you guarantee that this is going to look, you know, the same in my particular community, and particularly where that community may look very different from the places that there are studies. I mean, I think we really need to take more advantage of the natural experiments that are occurring. And so as we're seeing rollouts of whether it's walkability or bicycle lanes, is there more of a way that we can plan for the evaluation on the front end? Because I think we often do just have a few cases where we have really good research, but we don't have as many of those cases to map onto the places where policy might be looking to go.
Yes.
But I think it is a challenge. I don't know of any great answer from it. You might have a better answer than I do.
Well, yeah. Well, it is pretty difficult, especially. I mean, yeah. It is difficult too, and it's also like, where do you? I mean, we know that this works in Cambridge, and if you take this if you really think that this context is really important, well, Cambridge is quite different from other cities. So it's also possibly a step into a kind of the unknown. Where are the maybe sort of limits of your data, and how confident are you that this translates to other settings? On the other hand, I'm also convinced that we should do things and change things, and so that's what I'm struggling with sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's also a challenge for folks around what's the appropriate time frame. I mean, I remember when I was over in the UK and I was at Oxford, and they were doing exactly, you know, trying to set in the green biking lanes, and it took some time before it was, you know, it was in play. You know, the phased-in infrastructure improvements took some time, but also the intervention takes some time for people to adjust to actually using the newer infrastructure. And so sometimes our evaluations aren't recognizing that that time frame issue is so incredibly important. And so, and often in the policy context, there may be that drive for we want an immediate return on our investment. So that lots of really interesting but hugely challenging issues.
Yes, yes. Right, thank you.
Can I make one more plug that I forgot to mention? The Research Tested Intervention Program's website is open for international investigators, so you don't have to be a U.S. investigator to have your program posted here.
And so I'm, well, maybe a bit. So what I did before before I studied environments, I made a computer-tailored intervention in Dutch. So this was not effective, but if it were effective, it is in a different language. Would it still be? Can I still kind of post it, or?
If there's an English version, yes, we have to have something in English since it's paid for by U.S. taxpayer dollars. Yeah. But we've got stuff from Australia, we've got stuff from Canada. I can't remember which other countries we have, but we've opened it up. It used to only be U.S. investigators that were able to submit. I think we actually have something from a Japanese investigator as well, but they translated their materials into English.
Yeah.
But we post both versions.
Right, your sound is a bit falling away. Are you still there?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So we have something, I think, it has to be in English as well, but we post both versions. So we have something that's going through review that's from a Japanese investigator. So we can have both.
Right, excellent. Thank you. So if there are other questions, please raise your hand or type them in. And I think otherwise we need to, or we will close this the webinar soon. So if there are no questions, right, there are no questions popping up. So I actually propose to close the webinar if the presenters agree, or do you want to say something?
Well, Rick, thanks so much for helping to organize. I'd like to thank everyone for participating in this webinar, and thank you to Dr. Chambers and Dr. Vincent for joining us today. And please be in touch if you'd like to join the ISBNPA Policies and Environment SIG. This is April O. You're welcome to email me. I believe my contact information is on the ISBNPA site. Thanks again, and have a great day or evening, depending on where you are in the world.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you, Cynthia, David, April, and thank you, audience. So one final thing to remember is that this survey will pop up in a few minutes, and I really hope that you can fill it out. So I'm going to close the webinar now. And hopefully we'll see you at one of our conferences or future webinars. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.